The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. So, to show our appreciation for all of you who listen to us, we decided to do a bonus episode, but we want to put it out for everyone instead of as part of our subscription bonus content.
Yeah, so this episode is a little different than our normal topics because it doesn't involve ghosts or UFOs or cryptids, but it's still an amazing story. And if you like it, you can always check out our other bonus episodes and try one out.
They're only $3 an episode, and I have to say, I think they're worth it.
They most certainly are. We put a lot of time and effort into them.
We do. Okay, so let's get into our story tonight. When it comes to Titanic history, I think most people have heard of the unsinkable Molly Brown. Margaret Brown, known as Maggie, was a rather formidable woman who ran for Colorado's Senate seat in 1914, 6 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. She ended her campaign in order to serve as director of the American Committee for Devastated France during World War I. She also gave money to the families affected by the Ludlow mining disaster that same year, and she helped organize the International Women's Rights Conference that year too. But 2 years earlier, she also survived the sinking of the Titanic. And after her death, newspapers began referring to her as the Unsinkable Molly Brown for her heroic behavior during the sinking. As a first-class passenger aboard the doomed ship, Brown didn't just escape with her life, she actually helped evacuate the boat. And then once she was safely in Lifeboat 6, she grabbed one of the oars and demanded that the crew on board go back for people in the water. When the quartermaster refused, out of fear that their lifeboat would either be capsized by desperate survivors or get sucked under by the water, Brown threatened to throw him overboard. Once she was on the Carpathia, the ship that came to the rescue, Brown organized a committee made up of first-class passengers that made sure that the second and third-class passengers had their basic needs met. Maggie, or Molly Brown, deserved all of the praise that she received for her efforts and concern for her fellow passengers. The unsinkable Molly Brown is a phrase that has stood the test of time and conjures up pictures of a determined woman who did what she could to save others. But what you may not know is that there was another woman aboard the Titanic who also earned the title Miss Unsinkable, Violet Jessop.
Now, Violet Constance Jessop was born in Argentina on October 2nd, 1887, to Irish immigrant parents William, who was a sheep farmer, and his wife, Catherine. Violet had 5 younger siblings, and at a young age, she contracted tuberculosis. Only given a few months to live, Violet somehow overcame the deadly diagnosis. Violet spent most of her childhood years caring for her younger siblings. When Violet turned 16, her father died of complications from surgery, and Violet's mother decided that the family would survive better in England. So they boarded the Burgundy and arrived in London, where Catherine was able to get a job as a ship stewardess on a Royal Mail ship. When Violet turned 21, it fell on her shoulders to provide for her family, since her mother had become too sick to work. She didn't want to be a ship stewardess, but with her auburn hair, gray-blue eyes, and Irish accent, there weren't many other opportunities. According to ExploreTheArchive.com, finding a stewardess job wasn't easy. She was initially rejected for looking too young. But in 1908, she secured her first job aboard the Royal Mail Line ship Orinoco, which sailed in the West Indies. She sailed for 2 years before being wrongfully accused by her captain of flirting with the officers on board. Finding another Royal Mail Line ship was difficult, and Violet made the decision to apply for the White Star Line, which she didn't want to do. She couldn't swim, and sailing in the Atlantic Ocean scared the hell out of her. Eventually, she found herself aboard the RMS Olympic, a White Star Line passenger ship. The Olympic was one of the White Star Line's 3 luxury sister ships, the other 2 being the Titanic and the Britannic. On the Olympic's 5th voyage on September 20th, 1911, it sailed down the Solent, a strait between the Isle of Wight and Great Britain, captained by Edward Smith. Yes, the same Edward Smith who captained the Titanic. The Olympic found itself parallel to the British cruiser, the HMS Hawke. As the Olympic turned starboard, the captain of the Hawke wasn't prepared for the wide radius the luxury liner needed, and he was unable to get out of the way, and the 2 ships collided. Since the Hawke's bow was designed for ramming, it accidentally ripped 2 holes in the Olympic, one above and one below the waterline. It also twisted its propeller, and it caused 2 of the airtight compartments to fill with water. The Hawke nearly capsized, but miraculously, the Olympic was able to get back to port on its own. Violet was on board that day, but for some reason, she didn't mention the collision at all in her personal journals, which were incredibly detailed otherwise.
She was relatively happy working on the Olympic, but for some reason her friends managed to convince her to change ships. It would be better on the Olympic's sister ship. And so, dressed in her new ankle-length brown suit, Violet stepped aboard the Titanic. As a stewardess, she had several responsibilities. First, she was expected to clean rooms, deliver meals, and respond to all first-class passengers' needs, whatever they might be. MentalFloss.com adds that she would make beds, clean bathrooms, arrange flowers, and run errands. As a stewardess, she worked 17 hours a day just to earn £2 10 shillings a month. However, in at least one way, she did feel as though her voice was heard, at least by naval architect Thomas Andrews, who had designed the Titanic. He had taken the time to survey White Star Line employees, and he listened to their suggestions, altering the steward's quarters to reflect their ideas. Violet had incredible respect for Andrews, who went down with the Titanic when she sank just 5 days after she left the port of Southampton. Violet's personal journals reveal all kinds of things about the first few days of the Titanic's voyage, which began on April 10, 1912. Most interesting is her take on the first-class passengers that she was in charge of serving. According to MentalFloss.com, Violet was unimpressed by John Jacob Astor IV and his new young bride, Madeline. Astor had pretty much caused a scandal by divorcing his previous wife and marrying Madeline, who was 30 years younger than him. Violet expected Madeline to be beautiful and radiant, but she wrote, quote, "I saw a quiet, pale, sad-faced, in fact, dull young woman arrive listlessly on the arm of her husband," end quote. She was more veiled with her other entries, calling many first-class passengers by fake names, like Miss Marcia Spatz, who had, quote, many strange needs, including never-ending boxes of flowers, end quote. She also mentioned a Miss Townsend. Again, it must have been a fake name Violet gave to her, since there weren't any Miss Townsends on the passenger list. She said that Miss Townsend demanded that all of the furniture in her room be moved, and that the lady spent her, quote, happiest moments watching the agonized struggles of a couple of perspiring stewards tackling the job, end quote. According to encyclopediatitanica.org, Violet also wrote about Thomas Andrews, saying, quote, often during our rounds we came upon our beloved designer going about unobtrusively with a tired face but a satisfied air. He never failed to stop for a cheerful word, his only regret that we were getting further from home. We all knew the love he had for that Irish home of his, and suspected that he longed to get back to the peace of its atmosphere for a much-needed rest and to forget ship designing for a while." End quote. On the night of April 13th, she wrote that she often enjoyed the fresh air on deck before she'd go to bed for the night, and that, quote, if the sun did fail to shine so brightly on the fourth day out, and if the little cold nip crept into the air as evening set in, it only served to emphasize the warmth and luxuriousness within. End quote.
The following night, Violet was in bed, reading through magazines that she had borrowed from the ship's library, and skimming over a prayer that an Irish woman had given her before the Titanic set sail. The prayer was originally in Hebrew, and Violet found the translation difficult to understand, although she knew it was meant to offer her protection. She was drifting off to sleep when a loud crash and then a prolonged crunching noise made her jump wide awake. The ship shuddered to a stop. She could hear other crew members exiting their rooms, so she dressed quickly and she made her way up to the deck to her assigned area. According to mentalfloss.com, she helped passengers adjust their life belts and reminded them to all dress warmly, take blankets, and pack their valuables. All the while, she assured them that getting into the lifeboats was purely a precaution. She later wrote, of course Titanic couldn't be sinking. She was so perfect, so new. In fact, just like many of the passengers, Violet believed that the ship was unsinkable, and she didn't realize how dire the situation was until she happened to catch sight of the forward part of the ship angling down towards the ocean. She wrote, for a fraction of a second, my heart stood still, as is often the case when faith, hitherto unshaken faith, gets its first setback. And yet, she did what she was told. She continued to assure passengers that there were many other ships nearby and that they would all be rescued quite quickly. However, many of the passengers didn't speak English and couldn't understand what the crew were telling them. So Violet was told to model the correct behavior and to get calmly and properly into Lifeboat 16. She wrote that as the lifeboat was being lowered, an officer called, "Here, Miss Jessop, look after this baby," and a bundle was dropped into my lap. As the lifeboat hit the water with a bone-cracking thud, the baby began crying, and poor Violet could do nothing except wrap the child in the blanket she had thankfully brought with her and watch as the Titanic snapped in two. And with a thundering roar of underwater explosions, it plunged into the sea. Terrified that the baby might die in the frigid air, she held the child close for the next 8 hours as they waited to be rescued. Violet was one of the people rescued by the RMS Carpathia, and she wrote that as soon as she got on board, a woman ran up to her and snatched the baby from her arms. She wrote, I was still clutching the baby against my hard cork life belt I was wearing when a woman leaped at me and grabbed the baby and rushed off with it. It appeared that she put it down on the deck of the Titanic while she went off to fetch something, and when she came back, the baby had gone. I was too frozen and numb to think it strange that the woman had not stopped to say thank you. Violet was just 25 years old when the Carpathia docked safely in New York. She was only one of 706 people who survived. Architect Thomas Andrews, Captain Edward Smith, and John Jacob Astor IV were 3 of the 1,500 who did not survive. Knowing that if she didn't get right back on a ship, she'd lose her nerve forever, Violet was on board the Olympic once again barely 2 months later.
The only break she took was during 1914, when she joined the Volunteer Aid Detachment of Nurses. But by 1916, she was on a ship again, this time as a nurse, on the third of the White Star Line's 3 sisters, the Britannic. Converted from a luxury liner into a hospital ship, the Britannic was off the coast of Greece on November 21, 1916. Headed for the town of Mudros, it was scheduled to pick up some wounded soldiers. But the ship never made it. It hit a German deep-sea mine. At first, just like on the Titanic, the crew were surprisingly calm. Granted, they were all military trained, but the Britannic was sinking much faster than the Titanic had. Violet got into a lifeboat in what surely had to feel like the repeat of a nightmare, as the captain, Charles Alfred Bartlett, tried to save the ship by continuing to run the engines and steer her towards port. It proved to be a horrible, terrible mistake, as Violet watched first one lifeboat, then a second, get sucked into the propeller. The blades shredded both boats, killing soldiers and crew. Violet still hadn't learned to swim, but terrified of being sucked in by the propeller, she jumped overboard, only to resurface head first into the boat's keel. She wrote, quote, "My brain shook like a solid body in a bottle of liquid," end quote. By sheer luck, she was able to grab onto a passing lifeboat, which she clung to until a motorboat picked her up. According to DannyDutch.com, she wrote, quote, "The white pride of the ocean's medical world dipped her head a little, then a little lower, and still lower. All the deck machinery fell into the sea like a child's toys. Then she took a fearful plunge, her stern rearing hundreds of feet into the air until with a final roar she disappeared into the depths." End quote. Not realizing the extent of her head injury, she had actually fractured her skull, which resulted in lifelong recurring headaches. She was brought to one of the Greek islands in the Cyclades to recuperate. This was the final straw for Violet, and she finally left the sea. Over the next 3 years, she worked in a bank, got married, got divorced, and then she returned to boating.
All right, we'll get back to Violet's incredible story after this quick break.
Hey, did you know?
If you've ever heard the expression, "There are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on Earth," then you'd be correct if you took the number 75 and added 17 zeros to the end. That would equal how many grains of sand there are. And there are indeed more stars than that in the universe.
However, scientists have determined that there are actually more trees on Earth than there are stars in our galaxy. They estimate that the Milky Way contains anywhere from 100 to 400 billion stars. That's an almost incomprehensible number. But get this, there are an estimated 3 trillion trees on Earth, far outnumbering the stars in the Milky Way. Who'da thunk it? All right, we're back. So let's jump right back into Violet Jessop's story.
In June of 1920, she again worked for the White Star Line, which she continued to do for over the next 30-plus years, until the year 1950 when she retired at the age of 63. Throughout her life, Violet never publicly spoke about her experience on the Titanic or the Britannic. She was a very private person, and perhaps talking about the horrifying experiences was something that she just couldn't do. If it wasn't for Violet's detailed journals, no one would ever know her story at all. Before she retired, Violet shared a strange experience that she had had one evening. To set the scene, it was actually a stormy night, believe it or not, when her phone rang. When Violet answered, a female voice asked if she had saved a baby on the Titanic. When a very surprised Violet replied that yes, she had, this woman replied, "I was that baby." Then the woman laughed and hung up. Violet had never told anyone about the baby. Strangely, the baby she had saved was actually a boy named Assad Thomas. And the story of how he made it off the Titanic is also a bit strange.
Assad Tanis, whose family changed their surname to Thomas, was born in Lebanon in 1911. His parents decided to emigrate to the U.S., so his father left first and settled in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He chose Wilkes-Barre because his brother Bashir, who went by the first name Charles once he arrived, already lived in Wilkes-Barre. Assad's father sent Charles back to Lebanon to escort Assad and his mother to the U.S. Assad, his mother, and Uncle Charles boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg on April 10, 1912, as third-class passengers, which cost Assad's mother £8 10 shillings and 4 pennies. This would be about £914 today, or a little under $1,200. So it wasn't cheap. Assad's mother and Uncle Charles got into separate lifeboats when the Titanic began to sink. Uncle Charles was carrying Assad. Somehow, Charles must not have stayed in the lifeboat, though. It's unknown whether he gave up his seat to a woman and then he searched the sinking ship for another lifeboat for himself and Assad. But somehow, Assad ended up in Violet Jessop's arms. Charles Thomas did not survive, but thanks to Violet, baby Assad did. He took on the name Essed Alexander and lived to age 20, where he died from pneumonia in Whitehaven Sanatorium in 1931, years before Violet received the strange phone call. So, it's all very strange.
Violet, as we had said before, worked on ships until she was 63 years old. When she retired in 1950, she moved to a small cottage in Suffolk, where she raised chickens and grew mushrooms. She passed away in 1971. But her journals weren't discovered until 1996, and so her story wasn't really known until then. But here's the thing. Miss Unsinkable wasn't the only crew member to have survived the Olympic collision and the sinking of both the Titanic and the Britannic. There was someone else aboard all three ships, fireman and stoker Arthur John Priest. Remarkably, although Priest was there for all three, he actually survived 4 sinkings, including the HMS Alcantara and the SS Donegal.
Not as much is known about Priest. I'm assuming he didn't keep a journal like Violet did. But what we do know is pretty amazing.
Priest was born in Southampton in 1887 and spent most of his life working as a fireman and a stoker aboard steamships. A stoker is actually what it sounds like: a person who shovels coal for hours at a time into the furnace or furnaces of the ship to keep it moving. It was hot, sweaty work, and usually stokers wore very little clothing while working, and their bodies were constantly covered in black soot from the coal, earning the nickname the Black Gang. His first stoker job was aboard a Royal Mail steamship named the RMS Asturias when he was just 22 years old, according to AmusingPlanet.com. The Asturias got into a collision during her maiden voyage, but luckily no one died. 2 years later, Priest was aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with the HMS Hawk. But since he was in the bowels of the ship when it happened, his experience had to have been very different from Violet's. However, there are very few details online about his experience aboard the Olympic. Right before the Titanic set sail, there was a coal strike and many stokers found themselves jobless. The 24-year-old Priest counted himself lucky to secure a job aboard as one of the 150 stokers on the luxury liner. She had 29 boilers, so keeping them fed with coal was a grueling job. When the ship struck the iceberg, Priest was in his quarters between shifts, and by the time he made his way to the deck, almost all the lifeboats were already in the water. Not seeing any other option, he jumped overboard into the frigid water in just his shorts and a life vest. He was miraculously picked up by one of the lifeboats. He was one of only 44 stokers who made it out of the water. His toes were frostbitten, but he was still alive. At the onset of World War I, Priest was assigned to the HMS Alcantara, a merchant cruiser. In January of 1916, they pulled up alongside a Norwegian merchant ship that turned out to be a German merchant raider in disguise. The German ship opened fire, ripping holes into the bridge. The Alcantara fired back, hitting the munitions hold, and the German ship exploded. A third ship, the HMS Munster, arrived to rescue the crew from both sinking ships. At least 70 men died on the Alcantara, but Priest was one of the rescued stokers.
9 months later, Priest and Violet were reunited again, although there is no evidence whatsoever that the two of them even knew each other. But he was assigned to the Britannic. This was when the luxury ship had been outfitted as a floating hospital. When Captain Bartlett made that decision to try and run the ship aground, Priest was in one of the lifeboats that got sucked into the propellers. Remember how I'd said she watched those lifeboats get sucked into the propellers?
I know.
He was in one of those lifeboats.
Oh my God.
According to a BBC.com article, 30 men were killed by the unforgiving blades, but somehow Priest survived. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, quote, "Most of us jumped in the water, but it was no good. We was pulled right in under the blades. I shut my eyes and said goodbye to this world, but I was struck with a big piece of the boat and got pushed right under the blades, and I was going around like a top. I came up under some of the wreckage. Everything was going black to me when someone on top was struggling and pushed the wreckage away. So I came up just in time. I was nearly done for. There was one poor fellow drowning, and he caught hold of me, but I had to shake him off, so the poor fellow went under." End quote. And yet, Priest had the nerve and the fortitude to keep going.
In 1917, he was working as a fireman aboard another hospital ship, the SS Donegal. As the ship crossed the English Channel on April 17th of that year, a German U-boat fired torpedoes at it. As the Donegal sank, Priest suffered some sort of head injury that ended his career as a stoker. He was known to tell people that he really quit the sailing life because no one wanted to sail with him after all that. And all the disasters made people call him unlucky.
A poor man.
I know. He passed away from pneumonia in 1937 at the age of 49, but not before earning himself the nickname the Unsinkable Stoker.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder how these nicknames affected all three of them, Molly Brown, Violet Jessop, and Arthur Priest. Because, yes, they all survived horrible disasters, but by calling them unsinkable, I could see how it would have triggered survivor's guilt for all of them. You know, they may have been unsinkable, but for thousands of people, their lives ended in the water. And yet, their stories are remarkable and are a testament to all kinds of things: luck, fate, and the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah, they were both quite remarkable people.
And it's amazing to me that they were on all three of those ships at the same time.
I know. I just don't see how they kept going back on ships. Now, I understand that's your trade. You do what you know how to do. So, yeah, you have to make money to live. But my God, you're at the mercy of the sea.
Right. And Violet didn't even want to do it. But the impression was that because she was Irish in England at the time, she didn't have a lot of opportunities, you know? So maybe Arthur Priest felt the same way, that he, like you said, it was their trade. They didn't have many other opportunities, but I mean, dangerous, you know?
Well, we look at it now as being very dangerous, and it was, but they were hardcore back then. People did what they had to do to put food on the table, to take care of their families.
Right.
And they certainly just don't make them like that anymore.
No, to have the guts to get back on another ship is just, you know. It's interesting to me, too, that, you know, Molly Brown, because of who she was, because of her standing in society, she got a lot of credit for what she did. And she deserves it. I'm not trying to take anything away from her. But when you find out that there were other people that did similar things, it makes me happy when more stories are told and not just the one person that it's been focused on. It doesn't take away from them. It adds to the, like I said, the heroism and the fortitude and the, you know, importance of other people as well.
That it does.
And she saved a baby.
I know.
Here, take this baby.
She was a hell of a woman.
I know.
I mean, well, she was pretty young.
At the time, yeah. She was only in her 20s.
And really, they didn't have a diagnosis of PTSD back then. I imagine they both suffered throughout life due to all this. It had to have been awful.
Yeah, if she never talked about it. You know, people didn't know about her story at all until they read her journals, till they found them.
Yeah.
Which is interesting that her journals made it off the boat, unless she wrote it all down afterwards, you know, from memory.
Yeah.
But pretty amazing. I hope everybody enjoyed it. We thought it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, with that said, why don't you tell everybody about our sources, Beth?
Yes, so if you would like to know more about Violet Jessop or Arthur Priest or any of those ship disasters or even Molly Brown, you can check our sources in our show notes. There's a lot of information there that we didn't cover that you can spend hours looking at on your own.
And you know what? We should do the Hindenburg next.
Oh, jeez. Oh, the humanity? That's a pretty amazing story.
It is.
I know some things about it, and it was pretty amazing.
Growing up, well, it was talked about quite a bit. I even had a puzzle of the Hindenburg that I had put together, like a 1,000-piece puzzle.
When you were little?
Yeah.
Who bought that for you?
My mother.
Jeez.
I guess she figured it would keep me busy.
Yeah. Give you nightmares. Was it gray and white, black and white?
It was color.
It was colorized.
Yes.
Wow. Who knew they had such dark and horrible toys for, well, we knew they had dark and horrible toys for children, like the science sets that you could actually blow things up with. Yeah.
Yes, they had uranium and things like that. Well, that was part of my childhood, though. We had all the models also, like Godzilla, the Wolfman. All you people that weren't born in the 60s really missed out.
Yes, you could have your very own puzzle of the Hindenburg disaster.
We had the best of everything, though.
Jeez.
The bikes with the banana seats, the ape hanging bars, putting cards in your spokes.
Well, you could do that in the 70s.
Well, yeah.
I had a Barbie bike.
That was the 60s, 70s when I was still young.
Right.
A Barbie bike?
Yeah, it had streamers that came out of the handlebars.
Oh, the handlebars.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were like pink and blue and purple and silver. Yeah.
I miss those days. And with that said, we'll see you soon for another bonus episode next month.
Yes, you will. And sooner than that, with next week's episode.
We're talking bonus episodes, Beth.
I'm just saying there's always new episodes. There's always more.
Well, there's only one bonus episode a month.
Oh, okay.
And don't forget to check us out next month for an all-new bonus episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.